Hello and welcome to our next video in preparation of the Arctic Studies program lectures on Arctic Our Home on the 8th of September 2020, and also as a first look already at the lectures in November 17th to 19th of November on the notion of human rights and human security in the Arctic. When we talk about human rights in the Arctic, we very often talk about indigenous rights. Indigenous communities make up a huge part of the people who live in the Arctic, and they've called the Arctic their home for a long time. For example, in Lapland, in Sapmi, the Sami people have been living here for thousands of years. Close to about 8 to 10,000 years, basically since after the end of the Ice Age. There's a strong connection between the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, be it here in Sapmi or in Alaska, in Russia, in Canada, in Greenland, Norway or Sweden. There's a strong connection between the people who live here and the land. Often the outside perception of indigenous peoples has very little to do with the reality of life in the far north. The idea is often that indigenous peoples have been living a very different life from the reality. A lot of indigenous people live in big cities, but there's still also a big connection and big dependency in economic and cultural terms on the land. The outside perception of indigenous peoples has contributed to the regulation of their rights on the international level for a long time. Now, in the last years, since about the 1970s, indigenous peoples have played a much stronger role in also shaping international law, and they play an active role in the Arctic. In 1957, the International Labour Organization adopted Convention number 107, which still aimed, in line with the attitudes of that time. This international convention aimed at integrating indigenous peoples into the dominant societies and basically turning indigenous individuals into good workers, so to say. There was zero indigenous input there, of course. And it was still an instrument for a different time which aimed at very different things than the ideas we think of today when we think about indigenous rights. Indigenous rights law is part of international human rights law, and as such it is closely connected to other norms of international human rights law. A key norm for the protection of indigenous rights, for example, is Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, like the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights from the same year, they're both based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And together, these three documents form the International Bill of Human Rights, as it is often called. This is a classical human rights treaty, a treaty between states, created by states, without indigenous input, but protecting the rights of indigenous peoples and minorities. In 1989, the International Labour Organization created its Convention number 169. ILO 169 remains to this day the most important international treaty with regard to the rights of indigenous peoples. It contains collective rights and makes use of human rights litigation system, which is part of the International Labour Organization's own structure based on the ILO's constitution. In part, because this treaty is already more than 30 years old, in part the ILO Convention 169 has been superseded already by customary international law. You may have heard of the sources of international law: treaties, customary law, general principles, and only as a tool to interpret international law, also academic writings and judgments. The key sources of international law remain treaties and customary international law. in treaty law, ILO Convention 169 is the key document when it comes to protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. However, a lot of countries have not yet ratified this convention. In Finland, for example, like in Sweden, this has been discussed for a long time. Norway is a party to ILO Convention 169. Sweden and Finland are not. When I say that customary international law goes beyond some of the norms which are contained in this old convention, in ILO Convention 169, what do we mean by that? Customary international law requires two constitutive elements. This is state practice and opinio juris. State practice is what states actually do, how they behave, their declarations and so on. Opinio juris is the conviction that a state's practice is required by international law. That's the so-called paradox of customary international law, because a norm requires these two elements to exist as customary international law, but the state already has to be convinced that its actions are in line or even required by customary international law. State practice can consist of government decisions, especially of the way the governments implement international legal obligations on the national level. Human rights or international human rights law is realized on the local level. The key practitioners for international human rights law, they are not the judges at, let's say, the European Court of Human Rights, or not even practicing attorneys like myself. The key practitioners, they're the judges on the local level. They're the attorneys, lawyers on the local level who are bringing a suit, let's say, in an administrative law case based on international legal obligations. The implementation of international law on the national level is crucial for the full realization of international human rights standards. Another example for state practice can be the support for non-binding declarations, for example, in the UN General Assembly. One of the most important declarations in this regard, in the context of indigenous rights, was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the so-called UNDRIP. In 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted this declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, and it was indigenous peoples themselves, their representatives themselves, who played a crucial role in actually creating this document through mechanisms which in turn were created by the United Nations. The declaration itself is not binding, but it reflects customary international law as it was by 2007. Therefore, it also reflects the development of customary international law since the adoption of ILO Convention 169 in 1989. And the declaration is important because a number of countries actually decided to take the declaration, which is not binding on the international level, but turn it into a binding instrument on the national level. Turn it into an instrument of domestic law, or take parts of it at least, and implement it domestically. One of the key rights of indigenous peoples, of peoples in general, is the right to self-determination. That right is contained, for example, also in the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So both of these covenants unify the right to self-determination. This right to self-determination also protects peoples, including indigenous peoples, with regard to their livelihoods. It includes the right, for example, to decide over their own natural resources. And that is an issue which is really important, especially in the Arctic. Resource extraction is an important source of income for a lot of countries. If you look at mining, for example, here in Northern Europe, or the oil industry in Canada or Russia, you'll see that natural resource extraction is crucial economically and politically for a lot of Arctic countries. At the same time, resource extraction leads to land use conflicts. That in turn means that land which is used, say, for mining cannot be used for reindeer herding or other activities at the same time, and often it cannot be used for anything fruitful ever again. These land use conflicts also mean that the right to self-determination with regard to the economic resources, the natural resources of the lands of indigenous peoples, this right is threatened. States which have ratified these international treaties, they have a duty to ensure the protection of the rights of the indigenous communities. In practice, because land is usually not owned under private law by indigenous communities, but often, like is the case here, been administered by the state to a large degree. In many cases, international law requires not a veto power to be given to indigenous communities, but imposes a duty to consult. There's a concept called the free, prior, and informed consent, and that obliges states to consult with indigenous peoples if they were to engage in activities which affect, for example, their livelihoods. Free, prior, and informed consent as a concept is a bit of a misnomer. What is required is not consent, but consultation. So the indigenous communities have to be informed, they have to be heard, but they do not have a veto power. For example, in Finland, the Sami parliament has to be informed about mining projects, but only if a mining permission in the Sami home area is already given or is about to be given. They don't have to be, the Sami parliament does not have to be informed, for example, about an exploration project. So the consultation is also fairly limited, at least in the national law here. The idea is, of course, that indigenous communities would at least be heard and that they have a say in the matters which concern them. In practice, the realization of this is often very difficult. Think of hurdles like languages or long distances. If information is made available, for example, only in paper in an administrative building hundreds of kilometers from an indigenous home area, this kind of challenges can make the consultation process very difficult. So there might be a consultation process on paper, but with very limited practical benefit for indigenous peoples. And so far, the current law, also the international law, is still falling somewhat short here. There's an economic side to self-determination. And that is, of course, the ability to live from your own land in your traditional way of life. Now, traditional way of life does not mean that people behave like their ancestors would have done 100 years ago. This is a modern life, of course. But the activities, the economic activities, they're often closely related to the land. So that would be, for example, fishing or reindeer herding. Indigenous peoples have the right to make their own decisions regarding their land, just like any other people. Indigenous peoples are, and that's also included in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, equal to all other peoples. Often, indigenous communities have to make difficult choices. For example, whether to allow mining in a homeland in return for economic benefits. International law, however, lets them make these choices. Sometimes these choices might not be what an outsider might expect in terms of protecting the natural environment and so on. But international law allows indigenous peoples, like any other people, to make these choices. Indigenous peoples have lost their sovereignty in many regards. So they usually have experienced colonialism, be it long-distance colonialism beyond different continents, or be it like in Northern Europe or Russia, this adjacent colonialism that there was a group which basically just expanded and drove out indigenous communities from their original homelands. In the Nordic countries, we have consultation procedures involving the national Sami parliaments in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Elsewhere, indigenous autonomy goes a step further, for example in Greenland or in Nunavut in Canada. What is important, however, is that indigenous communities do play a role in shaping policies on the local level, on the regional level, on the national level, but also on the international level in the Arctic. And one way to do that is through international law. Public international law is a key element for the governance of the Arctic region. Here, international law is not just abstract, but it has real practical impacts. Despite political differences, the rate of compliance with international law in the Arctic is relatively high. Occasional violations of international law in the Arctic, they're actually fairly noticeable because they're the exception rather than the norm. What we have to distinguish, however, is international law on one hand and international politics, international relations on the other hand. When discussing these issues, you have to keep in mind that international lawyers might have different approaches, similar terminology, but different approaches when compared to international relations experts or somebody who's studying international politics. Governance is a result of negotiations, of cooperation between different actors. Governance can use law or legal tools as one way to come to decisions. But lawmaking, governing, is not just a purely legal process, it's also a social process involving different actors. To understand the Arctic today requires understanding international law and the role of international law for the Arctic, well, especially when it comes to protecting the natural environment, natural resources, but also climate change, for example. The textbook I recommend to you by Durfee and Johnston said that the Arctic has weak institutions and strong cooperation. And that's true, especially if you look at institutions like the Arctic Council, for example. What is important to note is that cooperation in the Arctic is often cooperation which crosses political divides. In the Arctic, cooperation is not a reduction of sovereignty, even though some politicians might see it like that sometimes, but rather cooperation is a way to exercise your sovereignty as a state. And this cooperation makes it possible that we take different views into account. Governance in the Arctic is far from perfect, with very significant problems, for example, climate change, environmental pollution, treatment of indigenous communities, and so on. We also have problems on a smaller scale. Violence against women and children, for example, or the high suicide rates in parts of the Arctic. Nevertheless, governance in the Arctic aims at improving the life of the people in the Arctic. This is a fairly harsh environment here, and cooperation can make it a safer place, and also a place which is of interest and a good place to live, also for future generations.